For those of you who don't know, I'm Rabbi Stephen Morgan. I'm one of the rabbis here. And this is Professor Matthias Henze, who is a professor of Jewish Studies at Rice University and the founding director of the Jewish Studies program at Rice University. So last week we talked about Judaism at the time of Jesus and sort of the setting that Jesus lived and preached in, and how we can learn more about what Jesus and his early movement was about by understanding more about Judaism at the time. And this week, we want to focus on a specific issue, and that is the question of how the concept of Messiah was understood in the Jewish world versus the Christian world. So in order to do that, we're going to start with a historical perspective. You all should have a handout that sort of has an outline. The outline has three parts. The first is the historical perspective. And then part two will be sort of will be a look at how the Christian world developed the concept of Messiah. And then the last part will be, so what happened in the Jewish world about the concept of Messiah in later times. So let's start with the origin. So the term Messiah comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means anointed. And anointed, I just actually cut my thumb this morning. That's why I'm wearing a Band-Aid. So you could anoint your thumb with ointment, right? It's putting ointment on your thumb to protect it against bacterial infection. But in this case, the anointment is actually a particular kind of, the fresh olive oil blended with a particular collection of fragrant spices. It's actually described in the book of Exodus for the first time. And this oil is prepared by one of the families in the tribe of Levi. And then it is used to anoint the holy implements that go into the traveling tent that the Israelites met in, where they believed that God's presence was felt. Later, that tent is, when they build Jerusalem, when they take Jerusalem and they build a temple, the temple becomes sort of the replacement for that tent. And so the holy implements in the temple get anointed with this same fragrant olive oil. But at the same time that it's used to sort of anoint these implements, which basically designates them as being holy and sacred for use, also in the book of Exodus it says that Aaron, Moses' brother, the first high priest, is installed into office as high priest by pouring the same oil over his head. So he, in a sense, becomes the first Messiah, the first Mashiach, the first one who is anointed with this oil, and therefore people know that he is the high priest. And when he dies, his son is elevated to high priest, and he is anointed with the same oil. And so for many generations after that, presumably the high priest was always anointed with this oil, and in a sense was a Messiah. Now I like to analogize, this is going to only take a couple more minutes, I like to analogize Israelite history to American history. So what you have is the 12 tribes of Israel. And when they first come into the land of Canaan and they're going to conquer it, they are not united. They sort of are confederated. So it's sort of like the confederated tribes of Israel, right? Analogous to the Confederated States of America under the old Articles of Confederation. And for those of you who studied American history, you know that didn't last too long because individual states argued too much and it wasn't cohesive enough. So they abandoned the Articles of Confederation, adopted the Constitution, and instead of the Confederated States of America, we had the United States of America. And so at the same time in biblical history, the 12 tribes of Israel say, we're not able to conquer the land acting individually as tribes. We need a leader to guide us together as a unified group. So they said, we need a king. So now they're going to have the United Tribes of Israel under a king, and that first king is King Saul, and lo and behold, he is anointed with the same oil. When he is replaced by King David is anointed with the same oil. His son, King Solomon, is anointed with the same oil. And so, therefore, we have a new line of messiahs, kings. High priests, kings. Everybody with me? So you might say, Rabbi, that's not the Messiah we understand. We understand this Messiah of the end times is going to bring in this universal whatever. You're talking about a very ordinary, functionary, a leader, a religious leader, the priest, and a civil leader, a king. But where's the Messiah? So what happens toward the end of the biblical period, prophets start to prophesy that the end of the kingdom is coming we're going to be conquered by the Babylonians, but we have a forever relationship with God, and God will, even though we're in exile, God will be with us in exile, and he will appoint for us a Messiah, a leader who will lead us back from the exile and restore our kingdom, and we will rebuild the temple and we'll go back to business, right? And so here, I give you some in B, 1B, I give you some references to that kind of future prediction of again, a sort of a human leader who is going to lead us back from exile, including the one in Jeremiah and another one in Ezekiel. And of course that is fulfilled. And in the book of Zechariah, that's in C, Zechariah has this vision of 2 olive trees standing behind the 7-branched lamp, which this lamp over here is sort of depicting, right? The lamp that was in the temple, which burned olive oil, right? So you've got 2 olive trees standing next to the lamp. This is his vision. And pipes are going into the lamp with golden fluid, which is presumably olive oil, feeding the flames. And the prophet asks his angel, what is this about? And the prophet says, well, these 2 trees are the essentially messiahs, the king and the priest. And the priest is named Joshua. The king is not so clear. Zerubbabel was the local governor, but it seems that Zechariah was not a fan of that person, so he never actually calls him a Messiah. Instead, he refers to the branch, meaning a branch from the tree of King David. And he doesn't really name who that is. But in any case, there are 2 Messiahs, and we are back in business. However, peace is short-lived. Then come the Greeks, and then the Romans who oppress Israel, and the Jews then return back and look in the Bible to see, is there a sign that we're going to be saved from these oppressive foreigners? And they say, yes, right? We have this forever relationship with God, so therefore a Messiah will be appointed who will help us to rid us of these enemies. And at this time, as we'll see, there sort of starts to be emerging, though, of this human leader with some idea about an ultimate end time that God's rule will take over the entire world and everybody will live in peace and prosperity and happiness and sort of an end times view, and maybe a semi-supernatural end times in which God is ruling, and this is the capital M Messiah. So it's at the end of the Second Temple period where we start to see this idea emerging, and now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Henze, who will show us some examples.
Good, yes, thank you, and good evening. It's wonderful to be back. What I would like to do is I would like to look at 2 texts in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, that have been interpreted by Jews and Christians to be messianic predictions. Let me just repeat one thing that Rabbi Morgan said, which I think is very important. When we use the word Messiah today, we tend to think of a divine agent who will come at the end of time to overcome the enemies and to usher in a time of peace. So it's sort of a clear expectation as to who this Messiah is and what will happen when this Messiah comes. And so the first thing to say is that such a messianic figure does not exist in the Tanakh or the Old Testament. We would think that there are texts somewhere in there that describe this Messiah, this messianic figure, and describe what will happen at the end of time when the Messiah comes, only to find that these texts do not exist. Why do they not exist? Because the concept, the very idea of an end-time agent, an eschatological messenger of God who will come to usher in this era of peace, was not known to the people who gave us the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. But it is a later product. It is a product of, as Rabbi Morgan just pointed out, what we call the Second Temple period. So roughly speaking, the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries before the Common Era. So these people didn't just come up with an idea that didn't exist, but they interpreted Scripture. So they looked in Scripture for texts that for them predicted the coming of such an end-time figure. And there's a handful of texts, and what I would like to do with you right now, and I will be very brief, challenge for the professor, is to read 2 such texts with you. Texts of which modern biblical scholars today do not believe that they actually talk about an end-time figure, but that have been interpreted already in antiquity, first by Jewish interpreters and subsequently by Christian interpreters, to be messianic prophecies. So the first text on your handout is taken from the prophet Isaiah. This is the description of an ideal king who will come from the line of King David. And this ideal king will reign in the peaceful future. So this text is closely related to other texts in the prophet Isaiah, perhaps best known Isaiah 9 and then Isaiah 2 also. Doesn't really need to concern us here. What I will tell you, though, before we read the text together, is that modern scholars, almost unanimously, the vast majority of biblical scholars, both Jewish and Christian, believe that this text was originally composed on the occasion of the coronation of a new king, the installment of a new king of the line of David in Jerusalem. And so scholars, people who wear bow ties, write endlessly about who this king was. And so some people say it may have been King Hezekiah. We don't know. A king at the time of the prophet Isaiah, which would be the 8th century BCE. Interestingly enough, from very early on, this text was interpreted messianically, though it is never quoted in the New Testament as a prediction of Jesus. So before I read this text, I want you to pay attention that it has 3 parts, verses 1 and 2, verses 3 through 5, and verses 6 through 9. So let me just read the text to you. But a shoot shall grow out of the stump of Jesse, a twig shall sprout from his stalk. The Spirit of the Lord shall alight upon him, a spirit of wisdom and insight, a spirit of counsel and valor, a spirit of devotion and reverence for the Lord. He shall sense the truth by his reverence for the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes behold, nor decide by what his ears perceive. Thus he shall judge the poor with equity and decide with justice for the lowly of the land. He shall strike down a land with the rod of his mouth, and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips. Justice shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his waist. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard lie down with the kid, the calf, the beast of prey, and the fatling together with the little boy to herd them. The cow and the bear shall graze, the young shall lie down together, and the lion, like the ox, shall eat straw. A babe shall play over a viper's hole, and an infant pass his hand over an adder's den. In all of my sacred mount, nothing evil or vile shall be done, for the land shall be filled with the devotion to the Lord as water covers the sea. Leave it to that. So what's happening here? Let's take a very quick look at these 3 parts. Part 1, verses 1 and 2. We learn of a shoot that will grow from the stump of Jesse. Jesse, Ishai, is the father of King David. That's the prophet saying there will be an offspring of the line of David. And then in verse 2, we learn that the Spirit of the Lord shall be upon him. Okay, so he is singled out by God, and he is given a spirit of wisdom, insight, counsel, and valor. So that's part 1. Then in verses 3 through 5, we move on to a description of the reign of this wonderful ruler and his principal activities. I would say the main theme of this passage is righteousness. He will act as a judge. He shall judge the poor with equity. He distribute justice, and there will be justice throughout the earth. There is some imagery of violence here, at least initially, right? He shall strike down those who oppose him. And then in verses 6 through 9, we move beyond the activities of this ruler, and now we learn that his reign will actually usher in an unprecedented era of peace. This is where we get these wonderful images of the wolf shall with the lamb. I've always thought that even then the wolf shall be slightly more secure than the lamb,
Yes.
but that's sort of like, we can talk about this. So not only will he reign in peace, but also once he ascends the throne, this will be the beginning of an era of unprecedented peace. And I cannot suppress but put in another plug for a book that I've written on this, and I shall read to you a short paragraph where I conveniently comment on just this passage. This famous description of the future king of the line of David, who will rule over a kingdom of peace, in which the wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, seems so fantastic, so utopian, that it is not too difficult to imagine why early Jewish and subsequently Christian readers of the prophet Isaiah understood this passage to describe no ordinary king, but the Messiah, the anointed one of God, who will appear at the end of time to establish a messianic kingdom of peace, even though biblical scholars would argue that the text in Isaiah was likely composed for the coronation of a new king in ancient Israel. It's a long sentence, a rather German sentence. Okay, so that's the first text, a prediction of what will happen once this king of David will take the throne. In the interest of time, I move on to the second text from the prophet Daniel. Some consider a prophet. In the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, David is listed under the Ketuvim, the writings. This is from the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel. The chapter has 3 parts. Daniel is a seer who has 2 visions. First, he has a vision of 4 beasts that come out of the sea. And then he has a second vision of a throne that is set up in heaven. And then in a third part, which is not on your handout, there's an angel who is kind enough to interpret to Daniel everything he has just seen. So the text that you have on your handout is taken from the second vision that Daniel has in that very chapter. Scholars call this a heavenly throne room scene. That is to say, we are ascending into heaven with Daniel, and there we see that a throne is set up, and God, who's called the Ancient One, sits on the throne in order to speak judgment. So in this text that I'm about to read to you, there is talk of a beast. The beast has previously appeared in the first vision at the beginning of the chapter, and it is an image for the Greek Empire. And then there's a little horn here that speaks arrogant words. The horn is an image for the Greek ruler who ruled at the time, whose name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We are in the 2nd century before the Common Era.
Just so Antioch, for those Jewish folks in the audience here, Antiochus IV, we know from the Hanukkah story, right? He is the ruler who puts an idol in the temple and starts a rebellion among the Jews, right? So he is the horn.
He is the horn.
Yeah.
So let's read our text. This is Daniel chapter 7, verses 11 through 14. I, this is Daniel, looked on then because of the arrogant words that the horn spoke. The beast was killed as I looked on. Its body was destroyed, and it was consigned to the flames. The dominion of the other beasts was taken away, but an extension of life was given to them for a time and season. As I looked on in the night vision, one like a human being came with the clouds of heaven. He reached the Ancient of Days and was presented to him. Dominion, glory, and kingship were given to him. All peoples and nations of every language must serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship one that shall not be destroyed. So what's happening here? Rather strange and difficult to understand. Daniel has a vision. He sees how God sits on the throne and how this beast is condemned to death. The beast, as I said, is an image for the Greek Empire. At the time when this text was written, the Jews were persecuted by the Greeks. And so Daniel sees a very encouraging vision in which God effectively overcomes the Greek Empire and condemns its current ruler, the horn, to death. And just as this has happened, in verse 13, a new figure appears. So Daniel calls him one like a human being. this chapter in the Bible is originally written in biblical Aramaic, and the phrase there is bar enash, which in Hebrew is the equivalent to Ben Adam. So this one, like a human figure, is sometimes called the Son of Man. So this figure, the Son of Man, comes riding on the clouds of heaven. He reaches the Ancient of Days, who is God, is presented to him. We're still in the heavenly throne room. And then the main scene is here in verse 14, where now there is a transfer of power. That is to say, the power is taken away from the beast and the horn, i.e. from the Greeks, and it is now given to the Son of Man. It's a promise of an oracle, if you will, that the Greeks will not rule forever, but that their dominion over the earth is now given to this Bar Enash or Ben Adam figure. And in fact, this dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away. So the question now is, of course, who is this Son of Man, right? How are we to make sense of it? And so what I would like to do is I would like very briefly to offer you three possible interpretations as to who this Ben Adam is. The first one is in fact taken from Daniel chapter 7 itself, because the third part of the chapter, as I just explained to you, is in fact an angelic interpretation of this very vision. Daniel, when he had his vision, was just as perplexed as we are reading this, but he had the really added advantage of having the angel there who explains it to him. And so the angel explains to Daniel later in that chapter that this individual is in fact no individual at all, but that the Ben Adam is another image for the people of Israel. Very clearly, the angel says what Daniel 7 is all about is that there's an eschatological turning of the tables. Now the Greeks rule, now the Greeks oppress you, but what this vision is all about is that God has already interceded, God has intervened, God has taken away the rulership, dominion from the Greeks, and he has now given it to you, Israel. So that's the first interpretation that we find within the chapter itself. If you read modern commentators, if you read modern biblical interpreters, they have another interpretation. They think that this person who came with the clouds of heaven is in fact no human being, but rather it is an angel. So what this text is all about is it's the transfer of power, of dominion, of rulership over the earth away from the Greeks, and it is given to an angel. There are two angels in the book of Daniel that are mentioned by name. They are Michael and Gabriel. In fact, the book of Daniel is the only book in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, in which angels have names. And it is those two, Michael and Gabriel. So I would say that the majority of biblical scholars would argue that this Ben Adam figure is another angelic figure who rules over the world. Thirdly, if you look at ancient Jewish and Christian interpretations, they dismiss all of this. They say it's not the people of Israel, it's not an angel, but this Ben Adam is none other than the Messiah. And so from this time on, Son of Man does in fact become a messianic title, which is, for those of you with a Christian background, Jesus is frequently called in the Gospels Son of Man. And it is quite clear when Jesus is called Son of Man, this is not just any title, but it is clearly a messianic title. It is one of the many designations of the Messiah, and it all goes back to Daniel 7. So to wrap this up, why are we reading Isaiah 11? Why are we reading Daniel 7? Because these are two of a handful of texts. I could add 3, 4 others from the Tanakh, which early Jewish interpreters read as predictions of the Messiah. I happen to believe, as does the majority of my colleagues who do biblical studies, that this was not the original intention of the author. That is to say, when Daniel wrote his text and when Isaiah wrote his text, they were probably not thinking of these texts as predictions of an end-time Messiah the way we do it. However, from very early on, this is how these texts have been interpreted.
Okay, so just to wrap up this section then, I mentioned that in the book of Daniel, they're talking about, where Professor Henze said that the horn, it represents Antiochus, the the bad guy in the Hanukkah story. And so Daniel is being written at the time the Maccabees are fighting the Syrian Greeks. So I just want to contrast what the Maccabees are doing with how later people understood what Daniel is saying. If you interpret Daniel as talking about this capital M Messiah who's going to usher in this end world time when God is ruling over peace and prosperity all over the world, that's one way of looking at it. But the Maccabees themselves were actually fighting a real war against real people, and apparently also thought of themselves as ordinary people. And when they were victorious, which was pretty amazing, the family of the Maccabees was a priestly family, so they naturally decided to anoint one of their members high priest, Messiah with a small m. And since they won the civil victory, they decided to also anoint the person with the crown, as it were, of civil authority as being the king. So sort of combining these two small m messiahs of priest and king into one person. But not in the sense of an end time. I mean, they were deeply involved in political issues and so on. If you study it, it was a very messy time, and they were certainly not considered by other people as being sort of agents of God and ushering in a messianic time period. So to conclude, though, the Jewish view at the time of Jesus, when they were talking about the Messiah, again, I like to analogize to American history. Jews at the time of Jesus were being now oppressed by the Romans, not the Greeks. They, again, read their prophecies saying, we have a forever relationship with God. We need a leader who is going to lead us in a revolt against these oppressors. We'll declare our independence, and he will become our king, Messiah. So the analogy to America would be George Washington, right? What they were looking for was George Washington to lead the Revolutionary Army, kick the foreigners out of our country, declare independence, and we'll elect them president. They didn't have presidents back then, so we would make him king, and another word for king is small m Messiah, right? So that's basically what Jews were looking for, most Jews were looking for, although there were also the capital M Messianists who were thinking, this is the final battle against evil, and after this battle is over, we'll usher in this age of perfect peace and harmony. So now, what happens in the Christian world?
All right. So we're moving on to number 2. I want to pick up on one aspect that Rabbi Morgan just mentioned, and I think it's very important, that at the time when Jesus lived in Israel, the first century of the Common Era in ancient Israel, there was a wide variety of messianic expectations. That is to say, you asked 4 different people, who is this Messiah figure? And you would get a tremendous diversity of expectations. And I think on the handout, Rabbi Morgan put there, I think, very helpfully, 3 of these aspects. This is at the beginning of age, and I want to come back to this very briefly. Namely, there are really 3 main streams of messianic expectations. One is the royal Messiah. That is to say, the expectation that the Messiah will come from the house of David, and he will rule as a king, as a strong military leader. The second expectation is a priestly Messiah. That is to say, a supreme high priest who will restore the temple and proper worship. And the third form of messianism is prophetic messianism, the restoration of Israel, bringing the exiles back home. So roughly speaking, there are 3 different forms of messianic expectations: the royal, the priestly, and the prophetic. So along comes the New Testament, along comes the earliest Christian writers, and they have to now figure out, how do we fit this figure Jesus into this variety of different messianic expectations? And so when you read through the New Testament, what you will see is that different authors of different books in the New Testament come down on different ends. So some will emphasize the royal aspects of messianic expectations and will describe Jesus as king, the king of the Jews. Then others will emphasize the priestly aspects. For example, there is the epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, and there Jesus is quite clearly described as the high priest. So this is an author, an early Christian writer, who emphasizes the priestly aspect. And then there are lots of prophetic texts. For example, if we pick up the New Testament, read the first book, which is the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew clearly describes Jesus as coming directly out of the ancient Israelite tradition of prophets. Jesus is another prophet. So there you have these three beliefs. What I would like to do with you is look at one text specifically, and if we have time, a second one a little later, namely from the Gospel of Luke. In chapter 4, I want to read a short passage there with you. This, in the Gospel of Luke, is the moment when Jesus goes public and has his first public appearance. Let's just read this text. When he, that is Jesus, came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Okay, let's unpack this. Last week, for those of you who were here, I started out with a short passage in the Gospel of Mark, Mark 3. And I ask you to pay attention to the Jewish element in the story. So let's do this here as well. Let's just be attentive to elements that might possibly be Jewish here. First, of course, is the place. We are in Nazareth, in northern Israel. Second, there is a synagogue here. All of this scene happens in the synagogue. Third, it's on the Sabbath day. It's the Shabbos, right? We learn here that Jesus went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. Luke wants to emphasize. And then fourth, there's a reading of a prophetic text in the synagogue. Is this the Haftorah? There's some debate. In fact, if you look up ancient Jewish commentators on the origin of the Jewish liturgy, as I've done, this text is actually quoted as a possible indication that there is a prophetic reading already in the synagogue. I'm not so sure because it's not really a liturgy here. It's more like a teaching, but that we can discuss. So Luke emphasizes that Jesus is very popular at the time, and I think the reason is that in verse 21, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing," is probably the shortest sermon in the history of Judaism and Christianity. So it's no wonder that Jesus is incredibly popular. So what does he actually read? He reads.
Was that supposed to be a?
Yeah, there's a little for my friend here on the right. Exactly, a little hint. Yeah, follow Jesus. Be brief. So Jesus is here given the scroll of Isaiah. When you go back to the book of Isaiah, you will see that what he's reading is actually a combination of two texts. One is Isaiah 58, and the other one is Isaiah 61. I don't have that on the handout. You have to take my word for it, or you have it all by heart, of course. And so Jesus is here referring back to Isaiah 61, in which we read, which is here in verse 18, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." And then later on, at the end of the quote, he picks up Isaiah 61 again, "To let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So quite clearly, what Luke wants to tell us here is that Jesus is, in fact, this anointed one. Jesus is this Messiah, this Mashiach, who was anointed, Mashach, and the Spirit of the Lord is upon him. So here's my question for you. Why does Luke pick Isaiah 61? Luke is the only one of the four evangelists, of the four gospel writers, who tells us the story. He creates the story, and obviously he puts this passage from Scripture into the mouth of Jesus. Why does he do it? Surely there could have been any number of passages in the Christian Old Testament that Luke could have chosen. Why Isaiah 61? And the answer, I believe, comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So text number 2 on your handout here is a short text from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are ancient Jewish fragments that were found in the 1940s and 50s on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea at a place whose modern name is Qumran. And one of these texts that was discovered in K4, modern scholars call the Messianic Apocalypse, or 4Q521. Heavily fragmented. There's only one copy of the text. Sometimes we're lucky, we have multiple copies. Maybe we have only one. And it consists of 17 small pieces. It's like stamps or jigsaw puzzle. So here I will actually walk you through the text because it's a little complicated. So we don't know this text from anywhere else. It was only discovered at Qumran. Its date is the 1st century before the Common Era. Roughly speaking, 100 years prior to Jesus. So let's read this together. I'll interrupt myself and walk you through it. Let's do the first 2 lines together. For the heavens and the earth will listen to his Messiah, Mashiach, and all that is in them will not turn away from the precepts of the holy ones. So apparently this text is talking about the arrival of the Messiah. And what it says is that when Messiah comes, heaven and earth will listen or be obedient to the Messiah. They will also be listening to the holy ones. The holy ones is code language at Qumran for the angels. When the Messiah comes, he won't come alone, but he comes with an angelic entourage, right? A whole group of folks. And now the anonymous person who speaks here turns to those who read the text, to us. And he says, strengthen yourselves, you who are seeking the Lord, in his service. So he is admonishing us. This is why this text was written. This is not just meant to be a prediction of what will happen when the Messiah comes, but he tells us all of this with a purpose. Get ready, strengthen yourself, anticipate this to happen. Line 4, will you not in this encounter the Lord, all those who hope in their heart? So he's telling you, get ready. This is a hopeful prediction, an oracle. And now he tells you what it is you should be hoping for. Line 5, for the Lord will consider the pious and call the righteous by name. So if you're pious and righteous, perhaps you're happy that when the Messiah shows up, he might call your name as well. And his spirit will hover upon the poor, and he will renew the faithful with his strength. And now comes the list of things that will happen when the Messiah comes. This is why we're reading this text. Line 7, for he will honor the pious upon the throne of an eternal kingdom, freeing prisoners, giving sight to the blind, straightening out the twisted, and forever shall I cling to those who hope in his mercy. This brackets mean that there is a gap. A goat took a bite out of our scroll, the Te'avon, and so it's gone. And the fruit of not be delayed, and the Lord will perform marvelous acts, such as have not existed, just as he said, for he will heal the badly wounded and will make the dead live. He will proclaim good news to the poor, and he will lead and enrich the hungry. Why am I reading this text with you? For a couple of reasons. One, we get here a list from a Jewish author, we don't know who this author is, of the things that are expected to happen, marvelous acts as have not existed, when the Messiah will come. And the second reason I read this with you is that we're asking ourselves, where does he get this from? Where all of these elements come from? And the answer is Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61 is one of the texts that our author used in order to figure out what will happen at the end time when the Messiah comes. Why is this significant? It's significant because it tells us that already 100 years prior to Luke, our evangelist, there was a Jewish author who used Isaiah 61 and understood it as a prediction of the Messiah. Luke, in other words, is not the first who uses Isaiah 61. he already follows a well-established history of interpretation. So the question I asked you 5 minutes ago when we were reading Luke 4 was, why does Luke pick Isaiah 61? Why does he put that text into the mouth of Jesus? If we didn't know the text from Qumran, this would seem arbitrary, and we would think that Luke just made this up. But now, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that Isaiah 61 already was interpreted messianically. For those of you with the Jewish background, I don't need to explain to you that there's no such thing as just the biblical text. The biblical text, Tanakh, always comes with an interpretation, with a certain interpretation. And interpretation and text really become one and the same. So my argument here is that Isaiah 61 was a text that by the time Luke writes his gospel already came with an interpretation. And the interpretation is Isaiah 61 talks about the Messiah. And so what Luke does very cleverly is he puts into the mouth of Jesus this text. And really all Jesus has to say is, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And Luke can, of course, assume that everybody knows exactly what he's talking about. Jesus reads the prediction of a Messiah, and he says, this is it. I am he. The problem is that if you don't know of the Dead Sea Scroll, if you don't know that Luke uses a text of which he can be certain that his readers knew exactly that it would trigger a certain set of expectations, then you're sort of missing this. You're missing the Jewish context. All right, I'm going to gloss over, in the interest of time, over Luke 7, but I did want to take a very quick look at text number D before I hand it back to Rabbi Morgan. A completely different aspect, not related to what I just talked about at all. This is a text from, again, the Gospel of Matthew, the first Gospel we have in the New Testament, and it is about the institution of the Lord's Supper. Let's just read the text. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So I told you a second ago that in the New Testament there are many different interpretations of who this Jesus was, and many interpretations of how we should understand his messiahship, his messianic identity. So I've picked this particular passage for two reasons. One, in Christian worship, often you have the Eucharist as part of the worship. And so what happens is that the priest or the pastor at some point will hold up the bread and the wine and say the words of institution. The words of institution are the moment when in Christian worship Christ is present. Christ is believed to be present. And now it depends on whom you're asking, whether it's a Roman Catholic, a Protestant, or somebody else, how exactly Christ is present. But the words of institution are tremendously important. And the words of institution are exactly what you have here in Matthew. Take and eat, this is my body, and drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. So that's the first reason why I read this text with you. It carries over into the Christian liturgy to this day and is of central importance. The second reason why I read this for you is that Matthew shares this episode with Mark and with Luke, but he changes it a little. He plays with the words. And one of the change is at the very end. He adds in the very last verse that I read to you in verse 28, the words, "for the forgiveness of sins." So the underlying idea here is that Jesus died on the cross in order to forgive the sins of those who believe in him. So before we met tonight, Rabbi Morgan and I had a conversation about what we wanted to do. We picked texts. He said to me, you really need to pick a text from the New Testament that says clearly that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah who died on the cross for the forgiveness of sins of those who believe in him. And I said, that's easier said than done, because even though in today's Christianity this is about the most fundamental part of the Christian faith, you would be hard-pressed to find a text, a verse in the New Testament that clearly articulates this. So if you read through Matthew, through Mark, through Luke, and through John, they say a lot about Jesus' trial, his death, and resurrection. But they don't have anything to say about this idea that Jesus died for the sins of the believers. It is very difficult to find verses that are quite clear. Paul certainly knows this idea. In the Epistle to the Romans, there are several places that I could have quoted. And I think what Matthew does, and with this I will wrap this up and give it back to Rabbi Morgan, here in Matthew you also have this idea. This is why he adds for the forgiveness of sins. Bear in mind that Matthew is writing several years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Most people would date the Gospel of Matthew to the 80s or 90s. That's half a century later. And so he puts into the mouth of Jesus already an interpretation of the significance of the death of Jesus, right? Jesus predicts the significance of how he will be remembered. And so what Matthew there does is he adds this little phrase, which is my blood, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins, in order to make the argument that Jesus died on the cross to forgive the sins of all Christians.
So by now you can see that we have some significant differences in understanding what the Messiah is supposed to be about. Admittedly, there were many different ideas floating around in the Jewish world at the time. I would say the idea of a sacrificial Messiah was not originally a Jewish concept, but became a very important one in the Christian world. So now we're going to move on to the next stage of what happened in the Jewish world. So after Jesus is executed by the Romans, about 35 years later, the temple is destroyed. Well, first of all, the Jews actually revolt against Rome. The revolution lasts about 4 years. Unfortunately, it's not successful, and the Romans crush the revolt. They destroy the city of Jerusalem. They slaughter thousands and thousands of the citizens in Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed. The Jewish world is in turmoil and catastrophe. So out of this shock, we have, again, if I were to analogize to America, we have our founding fathers, sort of like America had Hamilton. We'll see the play in a few months here in Houston, and Madison and Jefferson. So in the Jewish world, we had the sages, we call the rabbis of the Talmudic period. And they leap into this abyss of depression in the Jewish world, and they say, we can create a Jewish society, a Jewish culture, a Jewish living force that has a relationship with God and has preserves our traditions and our history. If we go back to our sources in the Bible and we reinterpret them to create a living society that doesn't depend on the temple. So they do that, but at the same time, they also want to get out from under Rome. So about 100 years after Jesus, they start a second revolution. And this one was under Simon Bar Kokhba. Now, before I mention this, the first revolution, which I said lasted for 4 years, when Professor Henze and I were talking about this, and I was trying to think of, so who is the messianic figure? Who is the guy who pretended to be the general leading the revolution in that great revolt of 66 to 70 of the Common Era? And I can't think of anybody, which is an interesting thing. There was no, quote, Messiah figure during the Great Revolt. But later, the second revolt, there is clearly a leader, and his name is Bar Kokhba. And he was considered by a good percentage of the Jewish people at the time as a Messiah figure. First of all, he managed to take the temple back from the Romans, which was pretty impressive. But unfortunately, his revolt was short-lived, and again, it was crushed. At that point, the Romans were so angry with the Jews, they completely demolished the city of Jerusalem and rebuilt it as a pagan city, and forbade Jews to enter it. But that was I would say, one of the major leading messianic revolts after the time of Jesus. Then came, in the 17th century, a fellow named Shabtai Tzvi, who many of you may know. By the way, you can Google these folks. You can use Dr. Google to look this up later to get a more complete description. Basically, he appears at a time apparently when there was some messianic fervor in the Christian world. Around the year 1666, there was an idea in the Christian world that this would be a good time for the Messiah to return. In the Christian world, they believed he was returning. And 666, I imagine, was part of the calculation there. That's a magical number in the New Testament for the bad guy, I believe. But in any case, so around that time, Shabtai Tzvi comes in and says, "I'm the Messiah." And he leads a bunch of Jews in he gathers a bunch of Jewish people behind his movement. He gets everybody all excited. Unfortunately, this was the time when the Ottomans are ruling over Israel. And when he claims to be the king of the Jews, basically the same thing happens to him. The Ottoman emperor calls him into the palace and says, "I will give you three choices. You can either be beheaded, you can prove that you are this supernatural Messiah person that will shoot a bunch of arrows at you and see if you live, or you can convert to Islam." And he chose option number 3 and converted to Islam. His followers, some of his followers continued to believe he was the Messiah. And there was some, you can read this again on the internet, there was some back and forth with the Jewish world, pretending maybe to be Jewish, pretending to be Muslim, creating a kind of a convoluted situation. When he died, many of his followers continued to believe he might be the Messiah and that he might come back. Just saying. So, not surprisingly, 100 years later, another fellow named Jacob Frank claimed to be the reincarnated or resurrected Shabtai Tzvi, and again, a messianic figure. And he was more radical and said, you know what, the end times are coming, and since the kingdom of God is coming, we don't need to observe all these detailed rituals. So he started to preach an antinomian, anti-halakha perspective. Needless to say, the Jewish establishment was not pleased. He ends up also dying and not being well known. Let me talk about a more normative view of the Messiah from Maimonides. Maimonides was a brilliant scholar, one of the formative brilliant scholars in Jewish history, lived in Egypt in the 12th century and was a rationalist, and he created for Jews our first statement of beliefs, things that Jews had to believe to be good Jews. Jews know that as the 13 principles of faith. Among them was a belief that the Messiah is coming. So what did Maimonides have to say about the Messiah and the Messianic era? As I said, he was a rationalist. So he talks on the one hand about some Jews who believe in this supernatural world when rivers are going to flow with fragrant spices, and we'll all be sitting around a big banquet table eating a big feast, and food is going to grow on trees, and there'll be no more war, no more bloodshed, no more pain, no more suffering, no more disease, people will live forever, and so on, and a bunch of other, as he describes them, impossible things. He then describes a more natural view of a messianic era when there's just peace and prosperity and a king ruling over the Jewish people in our homeland. The ingathering of the exiles, as you saw, was one of my job descriptions in the first page here. The Messiah is supposed to bring the exiles in from all over the world, and we will resettle in the land of Israel. We'll have our own independent country, right? So this is the picture that Maimonides paints and clearly is the one he believes. And he says, other than the fact that we will now live in our homeland and people will recognize us as good people, remember he's living at a time when that was not universally true, right? So and that the Messiah will be considered wise, and everybody will recognize his wisdom and probably also believe in God, although not necessarily Jewish, but will believe in God. But other than those things, there will be nothing. The world will still be normal. The sun's still going to rise in the morning. We're still going to have to eat food to live. We will eventually die, including the Messiah, right? And so life will go on, not a supernatural vision of the Messianic era. So let me just finish with the modern age. In the Orthodox world, there's definitely a belief in a Messianic person, that there will be a Messiah who will come, and most of us focus on the kingship aspect. Again, we'll return the exiles to Jerusalem, we'll become the leader of the Jewish people there, we'll rebuild the temple. So for those who are concerned about World War III, first of all, of course, with the Messiah there, everybody will understand that this is okay, God wants it. But aside from that, recently one of the chief rabbis in Israel, I was surprised to see him write, just because we rebuild the temple does not mean it needs to be built where the Dome of the Rock is. It's from the chief rabbi in Israel, right? That the temple can actually be built right next door. That's a big space up there, right? And one of the prophets does say all the world is going to come to Jerusalem to worship God. Sure. So fine, so the Muslims will go to their shrine and we'll go to our shrine and everybody will be happy together. So from an Orthodox chief rabbi of Israel, he said this. I thought I was the only one who said it until he did. And then, of course, in the Orthodox world, typically there's an understanding that we will go back to doing sacrifices at that time. We haven't done sacrifices for 2,000 years. Maimonides seems to be of two minds on this. He at one point says that sacrifices were done because that's the way everybody worshipped gods in those days. Clearly, since nobody worships anybody's God today with sacrifices, at least not any large group of people, why would we go back to doing sacrifices now? On the other hand, Maimonides also records in his Code of Jewish Law all the details about how sacrifices were done. He's the only person who created a Code of Jewish Law who talked about how sacrifices were supposed to be done. So if he doesn't think they're supposed to be done again, why did he bother going into such great detail about it? So that in the Orthodox world, in any case, is generally understood, yes, we will be doing sacrifices again. In the conservative world, well, let me talk about the Reform world, sort of the other end of the spectrum. So the Reform world does not understand a Messiah figure. Generally speaking, most Reform Jews believe it will be a Messianic era, right? Peace and prosperity, but no particular person in charge, right? Or certainly nobody of divine authority. So they talk about a Messianic era. The conservative movement, we're in the middle. This is a conservative synagogue. I'm a conservative rabbi. And typical with the conservative movement, we tend to be a little bit two-minded, right? So we have some people who are more traditional and some people who are more liberal. Let me just say that I personally don't believe there would be any reason to go back to sacrifices. 2,000 years ago, the rabbis already figured out how we don't need to have sacrifices, and they based it on some verses in the Bible. So there would be no reason to go back to doing sacrifices. Building a temple may be nice, but the worship service will be modern. I assume it will have, internet, camera, and so on, so Jews all over the world can watch what's going on inside. As the chief rabbi said, we don't need to disturb anybody else's shrine in order to do that. And if there's really universal peace, something should clearly be workable. Some kind of arrangement could be made. But the idea is that there would be universal peace, and as a result of that, a peace dividend, which would result in prosperity. We continue to wait for the Messiah to come, and in the Christian world, they wait for him to return.
Come back.
And the old joke, and I guess I'll end with this, right, which most of you have probably heard, right? So when the Messiah comes, we will ask him if he's been here before. And so I guess we'll end with that for now, and we will be happy to take questions.
Will you explain the
Yes.
There's a little different format than we did last week, in that we have two microphones, I think one on the right and one on the left. So if you have a question, what we ask you to do is go to one of these microphones, please. I think that's the idea.
Yeah, right, yes.
I have a question. It's really out of ignorance, but if the Messiah is from the house of Jesse.
Correct.
the shoot of Jesse, and the lineage is traced down to Joseph. And I've never understood the relationship between Joseph and
Right.
Jesus
Right.
and how that connection is made.
Right, yeah. So let me explain. The question goes back to the first chapter in the New Testament. The gentleman is referring to the lineage of Jesus that we find in Matthew chapter 1. So what we have in Matthew, which we don't have in the other, at the beginning of the other Gospels, we have something like this in Luke 3, is the genealogy of Jesus that does indeed start with Abram, as you say, and it has three parts. It goes from Abraham to David, from David to the Babylonian exile, and from the Babylonian exile then to Joseph, right? And then the next thing we learn in the second part of the chapter, still in Matthew 1, is that Joseph is actually not the father of Jesus, right? That it's a miraculous birth of a virgin. And so your question is, how do the two go together? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't think there is a good explanation. What Matthew is trying to wrestle with is what the early church wrestled with as well, namely that Jesus, according to the Christian faith, was entirely human and he was entirely divine at the same time. He has to be entirely human because otherwise the salvation that Christians experienced through Jesus would be fake. It wouldn't really work. He has to be entirely divine because he's part of the Trinity. He's part of the Godhead. And so you have two stories of origin in Matthew 1 juxtaposed that address these two elements. One is that Jesus is indeed of the line of David. He is, in fact, has blue blood in himself, right? And the other is that he's entirely divine and that he is the offspring of a virgin. How the two go together is what the early church has tried to figure out for 300 years. But I don't think that Matthew answers this question.
In Torah is written that Moshiach is supposed to be from the generation of King David.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you look at the book of Matthew
Mm-hmm.
and book of the other one, Luke's.
Yes.
Luke. When they put all the generation, the names is just completely different.
Correct. Already the grandfather of Jesus has
all of the
different
names,
names
they are
in the two
different.
Gospels. Correct.
So which one you're going to believe?
Ah.
Which one you're going to believe? And in a Jewish religion, if the Torah, you have one small letter wrong,
Right.
they don't use that one anymore.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
But with this one here, like I said,
Right.
Luke's and Matthew, they are completely different.
Yes.
As far as generation.
Yes.
And some people, they say, okay, maybe, he wasn't, but maybe Miriam was the generation of King David. But we don't use this, supposed to be a man, not a woman.
Right.
And even if they saying that she was, why they didn't write her down, that she was the daughter of so-and-so and so-and-so and
Okay.
so-and-so, instead of using
Right.
that.
Okay.
So we have four Gospels in the New Testament. They don't see eye to eye on many issues. This just happens to be one. There are lots of differences. And so if we wanted to try to reconstruct the life of Jesus, and we were to treat the Gospels as historical documents that are factually correct, you will run into many, many problems. And you're absolutely right that already the name of the grandfather of Jesus is different in Matthew 1 from Luke 3. Which one is the correct one? We don't know. This happens to be the nature of Scripture. There are plenty of examples I could give you in the Tanakh itself, where the biblical authors contradict each other, and sometimes the same biblical author contradicts himself or herself within the same chapter. That lies in the nature of Scripture, and I can't give you a good answer. What was the real name of the grandfather of Jesus? I don't know.
Okay.
I'm just curious, this is a little off subject, but on subject, when you're talking about both aspects of the priestly aspect and then the royal,
Yes, yes.
what do you think the messianic significance is of the scriptures that talk about, and forgive the pronunciation, Melchizedek?
Uh-huh. Good, yes. It was an excellent question. So in the book of Genesis, in the 14th chapter, we read that Abraham, there he hasn't changed his name yet, his name is still Avram, follows a group of Canaanite kings who have hijacked Lot. And he brings him back, and as he returns, comes back, there is this figure that shows up out of nowhere, whose name is Melchizedek, who welcomes Abraham. It's just 4 verses, very strange. He is the king of Shalem. Most interpreters think that's Jerusalem, we don't know. And they're quite peaceful with one another. He is also a priest of sorts, and they sit together, and Abraham gives him a tenth of everything that he has, or Melchizedek gives him. It's all very unclear. So who is this figure Melchizedek? We really don't know. He seems to be some priestly figure. He's mentioned one more time in the Tanakh in Psalm 110. But then in Second Temple literature, he acquires great prominence. And so there is in fact a text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls that is entirely about this figure of Melchizedek, who seems to combine these 2 elements. That's where you're getting at, the kingly and the priestly element. I don't think he's called the Messiah there. He seems to be some heavenly figure in this Qumran text, which he isn't in the Hebrew Bible. So this is another example of a amorphous, not so easy to understand, obscure figure in the Tanakh that then gets interpreted. I don't think he is a messianic figure. At least I'm doing this from memory, obviously. I don't think he's ever called a Messiah.
Whenever he was called, just in the little bit of studying I've done, it's especially when being maybe paralleled with the Christ,
right?
There being, king of
Absolutely.
Salem,
yes.
Peace,
yes.
and then
Absolutely.
Jesus being called Prince of Peace.
Yes, absolutely.
There being all these different references.
It's a play, yes,
right.
I completely agree. So I think what Rabbi Morgan said at the beginning is that there are a set of elements, right? Peace, kingship, priesthood, they are floating around, and sometimes they come together to form a messianic figure. But the word Messiah is not always used. So we had an argument about the Maccabees, for example. The Maccabees did not call themselves messianic, even though they did all of these things, but they shied away from that terminology.
Yeah, I would just say the Jewish interpretation of Melchizedek is simply, first of all, that he was not Jewish. And many commentators point to that and say, well, God appears to people who aren't Jewish too, and people who aren't Jewish can have a relationship with God. And I would say, aside from the Dead Sea Scroll, which did not become normative in Judaism, he would never be considered a messianic figure in the Jewish world because he's not Jewish. And that's not to say that texts can be used and reinterpreted by people in later times. That happens all the time. And it could be that the person who wrote the Dead Sea Scroll, if he had in mind this character and not some other person named Melchizedek, might have said, well, I want to make a deal out of him. There was a Jewish tradition, for instance, that Hanoch, in Genesis, was a person who walked with God. He didn't die; he walks with God, and so there was a Jewish tradition that he didn't die. And so he's still alive, and he later reappears as the prophet Elijah. So that's clearly a Jewish midrash, a later interpretation, taking a biblical figure and turning him into something he wasn't originally, right? And the Melchizedek story could be something along those lines.
Good, thank you.
I had a question from my wife for Rabbi Morgan, which is whether the Messiah, from a Jewish point of view, is purely human or would be divine. And then my question for Professor Hinsey is, when Jesus was before the Sanhedrin in Mark 14:61, he's asked at point blank, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One, and he says, I am, and then after that, the reaction is that he's committed blasphemy. So I was wondering what contour of Messiah is being reacted to there.
Right, right.
Well, so that's a passage that a lot of Jews are, I would say, puzzled at, that particular last passage you mentioned. It would not be considered blasphemy to claim you're the Messiah, right? If it was, we wouldn't get one. Anybody who claimed to be the Messiah would be stoned for being a blasphemer, right? So that's not a problem. A claim of the divinity of Jesus would have been an issue, right? That's something that is different between Jews and Christians, right? So the Jewish view is that God is God and humans are humans, and God never became a human and won't become a human. So if you claimed you were divine, that would be an issue, because then you're. But the passage you quoted doesn't say he claimed to be divine. He just claimed to be the Messiah. Yes?
Yeah, but I think that's exactly the problem. That's why he is being accused of being blasphemous.
Well, yeah, I don't. Yes, but in terms of trying to understand what the text was, what the historical event that took place was, I don't think his claim to be Messiah would have been considered blasphemy. I don't know how that would be considered blasphemy if he claimed to be the Messiah.
There was the other question about whether the Jewish Messiah is considered to be divine or not.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Yes. Right. Yeah. So the Jewish Messiah would not be considered to be divine, right? So when we look at the stories in the Tanakh in the Old Testament, right, the human characters are all sort of catalysts for the supernatural events. For some reason, this is kind of a curious thing, actually. Why did God need Moses to free the Israelites from Egypt? Right? Couldn't God have just appeared to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go"? Apparently not. Apparently, he needs a human being to be an intermediary. Right? But in the Bible, it's always clear that the human being is only the catalyst, is only the intermediary, not doing any of the special effects. No miracles come from Moses. The miracles are all God's miracles. Right? So that's sort of the model for the Jewish people, that the Messiah would be a human. God may perform miracles to make the Messiah be effective and put him onto the throne. That certainly was the expectation, I would say, at the time of Jesus, and amongst some people perhaps today, that God will make some miracles to make it happen. But the human being would just be a human being.
Thank you. So regarding the story that's called The Last Supper, the Last
Yes.
Supper story.
Yes.
In the Jewish Study Guide, the white book, on the commentary, I read that the Pesach Seder is actually post-biblical and post-70 AD, the destruction of the Second Temple, correct? That's what I read the other day.
So
So the question is, how could, if that was, if this Passover Seder is post-70 AD, how did Jesus have a Pesach dinner?
Sure.
So I was thinking, maybe it was really an Erev Shabbat dinner.
Yes, right. So that's a very good question. So let me try to answer a little bit. There's some confusion about that. I think in 3 of the Gospels it takes place on the night of Passover, and one of them is the night before Passover.
John is different, yes.
So, just so you know, a normal Jewish meal would be normal, perhaps, to have wine. And when you're having wine, you would say a blessing over the wine before you drink it. And certainly would be normal to have bread. Bread was considered the staple of the meal. You have to imagine a Middle Eastern, if you go to Fadi's over here on Beach Nut, right, that's sort of the Middle Eastern meal, and you always have to get your pita bread, because before forks, knives, and spoons were invented, the pita bread was your fork, knife, and spoon. So you needed that to pick up the sauce, the hummus, and the tahina, and everything else, right, to eat. So bread was the staple of the meal. You would say a blessing before you ate the bread. And so it could have been any meal he was having. But if it was the night of Passover, as 3 of the Gospels say, then it would have been a Passover meal, perhaps with a Passover lamb, right? But not a formal Seder. You're correct about that. The formal Seder that we do today was really developed after the temple was destroyed, and the centerpiece of the Seder meal, which was the lamb, isn't there anymore, right? So how do you have a Seder meal without the centerpiece? Well, the rabbis created a more elaborate ritual that we could do, and that became the Seder. Jesus would not have recognized that Seder.
So, that So then the connection is that Jesus in the
Well,
Testament is the lamb connected
Correct.
with the Passover Seder
Correct.
story.
yes,
Yes,
but
that's-
that could still definitely
Yes.
be the case because the temple's there. There was a Passover lamb, and that
Yes.
could explain how he's understood to be the sacrifice that atones for sin. If you think about the Passover lamb in, I'm just sort of making an argument here on the Christian side.
Go right ahead.
But so if you think about it, so the Passover lamb is commemorating the original Passover in Egypt, where they would slaughter a lamb and use the blood on the doorpost of the house, so the angel of death would pass over those houses, right? So if you go back to that story and you see Jesus as being in that position, right? So then he helps you overcome death.
You take one or two
Maybe.
more.
I haven't seen that in a Christian writing. I'm kind of making this up. But
Yes, exactly. Should write an article about this. Yes, please.
In Peru, I believe the lamb is substituted by a guinea pig. But my question is in regard to something that I think comes out of Isaiah is a tradition of Jesus being a suffering servant.
Yes.
And how does that
Good.
allied with your three different formulas, or is that just
Right.
an extending variation?
So I read with you two texts, Isaiah 11 and Daniel 7, and I said I could have read with you 3 or 4 or 5 other texts in the Hebrew Bible that from very early on were interpreted as predictions of the Messiah. One set of texts are also from the prophet Isaiah, and they're called the servant songs or the suffering servant songs. They are a group of 4 short poems that are inserted into Isaiah beginning chapter 40 and then running all the way through chapter 53, what scholars call second Isaiah, that talk about an unidentified individual who is singled out by God in order to go to the nations to bring about peace. And the 4th of these songs, which begins in the middle of chapter 52 and runs through all of chapter 53 of the prophet Isaiah, paints a rather dramatic image of this individual because this individual suffers. And the suffering is vicarious suffering on account of Israel. And you are absolutely correct that these 4 suffering servant songs have been interpreted very early on as predictions of Jesus. So why is this significant? A, we don't know who this individual is. If you read commentaries on the book of Isaiah, all commentators have to answer this question. Who is this person? The answer is we don't know. Could be the prophet himself. Could be a king. We don't know. This individual is never identified in the text. However, already in the Gospels, these texts are used as descriptions of Jesus. Unlike the text that I read with you, Isaiah 11, that is never quoted in the New Testament, the suffering servant songs are quoted all over the place. Why? Because they explain perhaps the origin of this one element that Rabbi Morgan said very helpfully is so foreign to a Jewish understanding of the Messiah and yet so integral to a Christian understanding of the Messiah, namely that the Messiah suffers for other people, this idea of vicarious suffering. So the question, where does this come from? Where do the New Testament authors get this idea from? And the one source that most commentators will point you at is, you say quite correctly, are these suffering servant songs. So again, early Christians read these songs as predictions of Jesus. And I tell you, I read these texts with my students. They're actually, when you read them very carefully, they're difficult to understand. And then I asked my students at Rice, who is this individual? Right? Isaiah doesn't tell us. And my students are just, look at me, and say, what kind of a question is that? It's Jesus. And then I said, wait a minute, this is the prophet Isaiah. It cannot be, but to them it's so second nature, right? So yes, may very well be the origin of the idea of vicarious suffering of the Messiah.
Could it have been Isaiah himself?
Of course, could be the
Yes.
prophet.
Yeah, so having just made the argument for the Christian understanding of the Passover lamb, I just have to say this so that nobody goes home and says, oh, the rabbi was saying, whatever. So,
They will.
yeah, they will, right?
Right.
Right, it'll be all over Facebook.
Yes.
So the traditional interpretation of Isaiah 53 from the Jewish perspective is that it's either A, Israel as a people,
Right.
and there is one of the suffering servant songs in Isaiah actually says Israel is the suffering servant. And remember, Isaiah is a prophet in the exile. Isaiah 2, so chapter 53 is the second Isaiah. So he's prophesying to the Jews in exile in Babylonia. And he's saying, you're suffering now, right? And you're suffering not because of anything you did, but eventually we're gonna come back. So that's how it would be understood. It's possible it may also be the prophet, and there's other interpretations, but in the Jewish world, was never associated with the Messiah, and the text itself doesn't associate itself with the Messiah.
That's correct.
So we didn't see that as a model for the Messiah.
Let's take one more question and then.
My question is for Rabbi Morgan.
Yeah.
And this is related to whether the Tanakh ever attributes divinity to the Messiah. I was curious how you interpreted Isaiah chapter 9, the first 8 verses, particularly verse 7, where it says that a great light is going to shine in Galilee. It's going to bring joy to the people in Galilee. And then it goes on to say, For you shall break the yoke of their burden and the staff of their shoulders. The rod of their oppressor is at the battle of Midian. For every boot of the booted warrior in the battle tumult and cloak rolled in blood will be burned, fuel for the fire. So clearly we have these overtones of peace being brought to God's people. And then it says, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders.
Yes.
And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God,
Right.
Eternal Father,
Yes.
Prince of Peace.
Right.
And there'll be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and uphold it with justice
Right,
and righteousness.
right, correct. Okay, so that's first Isaiah, right? In the early chapters are
Yes.
first Isaiah, a prophet in the 8th century. Again, we were suggesting perhaps that the chapter 11 that we read was about King Hezekiah being enthroned. So it could be that he's referring to something that's going on right at that time. The point of that prophecy, though, is that there's going to be somebody born, his name is going to be this, and it's going to prove to you that it's what I'm saying is true. And he's talking in the 700s before the Common Era. So the the normal Jewish interpretation would be that doesn't really have anything to do with Jesus 700 years later. Now, that's not to say that we don't all reinterpret verses, but the reinterpretation of that verse to assume it's Jesus is not inherent in the text and would not have been a move that Jews would have made because we didn't see Jesus as the Messiah.
But
That's
there's-
not to say that Christians can't, but it's just that it wouldn't happen in the Jewish world.
But with the statement of unprecedented peace and then those titles that are ascribed, Eternal Father, Mighty God,
Right.
those seem to be ascribing deity to this child who will be born, is the way
So
I
if I may, we need to be very careful here that when you come from a Christian background, you hear Son of Man and you say, that's Jesus. And you hear Mighty Warrior and all of these, right? This is the Christmas story, right? If you're a Christian, you hear these words, you hear the snowflakes come down. I mean, it's just like second nature, right? But you have it all wrong. I'm sorry to be, right? We're reading a text from the 8th century BCE that introduces these terms that then subsequently were used by Christian writers to describe Jesus, which is totally fair game. But now to say, therefore, after we have been taught in our religious upbringing that these are titles that have been applied to Jesus, go back and to say, oh, therefore, the figure who is being described in the 8th century is Jesus, is a jump.
Anachronism.
So you've
Rabbi
got a
Morgan,
problem.
Would you say that those titles were ascribed to someone in the past?
Absolutely. What I'm saying is that Isaiah, and I feel very strongly about this, that Isaiah 9, this text, was composed when an heir to the throne of David was born. And there were exaggerated expectations what King Obama or King Hezekiah, the Messiah, would bring to the people. And these expectations were blown out of proportions. And then later on, somebody reads the text and says, this cannot be no ordinary figure. This must be somebody who is greater than just a king in Israel.
But Isaiah does give two titles, Mighty God and Eternal
Gives
Father.
plenty. There's a
How
long,
how did
long...
those, I'm just curious how really Rabbi Morgan understands those two terms that Isaiah uses.
You know, I have to, there's lots of terms that are used in many cases. I mean, we just don't associate those terms with Jesus.
But would you say they ascribe deity to the Messiah, I guess was my
No, oh,
question.
no, definitely not. No. So we didn't include, one of the texts we left out here was one where it talks about Son of God. One of them is in the book of Psalms, I believe. Yeah. So, and God says, you're like a son to me, right? We don't understand that literally, right? So the king isn't literally the son of God. That's just a figure of speech.
Where it's interpreted as mighty God, what is the Hebrew? Is that actually, is mighty God the only way?
So people have, actually, many biblical names were called theophoric names. They're names that included God's name in them, right? Yeshayahu is God is my savior. Isaiah is God is my savior. It doesn't mean that Isaiah is the savior. It's just he's named to reflect that God is the savior, right? So it doesn't reflect that the person is divine. It's just talking about God in the person's name.
So I think we need to call this.
Yeah, I think we have to end, unfortunately.
Well, afterwards, we'll be here. You can ask us. Okay,
sorry,
thank,
I had
thank
the
you.
answer to the Isaiah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, that's right.
Make a quick
Thank you
announcement.
very much for coming.
Next week. Make a
Yeah,
quick-
oh, yeah. So please come back next week where we're going to talk about our prayers and our aspirations, where we try to show that despite our differences, we have many things in common, and we really need to work together to make the world a better place.
Perfect.